Now, you had made a detailed study of the riots during the Ayodhya Rath Yatra movement.
Yes.
And you had even shown how the Rath Yatra and the riots were not connected. The Rath Yatra happened on one particular day, riots happened in some other locality in some other day, but always the press and the larger collective projection correlated them, and you published the book on Ayodhya and the future of India.
Yeah.
What was the reaction of Western academia to your exposure?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned those details, but those details have not been noticed by anyone. All that they saw was that I was defending a position that happened to be taken by these ugly vicious Hindu nationalists. And so that was enough for a serious boycott of me. I read my paper on Ayodhya, which was like at the same time as my very first book came out, 1990, in the annual Ramayana conference, which at that time, by coincidence, happened to take place in my hometown. And so I was vomited out by many of the professors there. I mean, and even, you know, as disputes go among academics, I'd say really quite emphatically. You see, because they thought that this was an intolerable interference of politics into their august academic business. Whereas, you know, all the conclusions that go against Hinduism, they are taken in stride all the time. You see, at the American Academy of Religion, the great trend-setting body in this field, you know, you have anti-Hindu discourses all the time, every year. And that is perfectly accepted. And nobody who stands up and says, I will not tolerate this political talk in my academic gathering. So that is taken for granted. Whereas anything in the opposite sense is immediately a scandal.
So how do we tackle this from your point of view? How do we tackle this as a civilization and as a secular, objective academician?
Yes. Well, there are different smaller contributions, and all together over some years they are going to make the difference. One thing that you don't have to do, because it's automatically happening, is simply a certain getting used to Hindus in power. You see, with Vajpayee, but especially with Modi, the world is seeing that Hindus are not doing anything terrible. In the 1990s, all these big Indologists used to predict that, oh, you see, they're going to destroy Indian democracy, and they're going to come down on Dalits and on women, and they're going to throw all the Muslims into the Indian Ocean. And, you know, now that they're in power, nothing of that is happening. You know, you can make a lot of fury about, for example, when Modi had just come to power, these Christian churches in Delhi that were so-called being vandalized. You see, once in a while, yeah, there exists vandalism. And so then that was suddenly tied into the new government. So, you know, whereas, of course, the usual suspects keep on pretending that India has become a terrible place because of the Hindus, in fact, the world sees India flourishing. And it's doing quite well. And you see in international diplomacy, it's playing its role. Economically, it's growing. Its infrastructure is visibly getting better. You see all these foreign tourists who can see the difference today with 10 years or 40 years ago. And so you see, they are not very, very deep, very serious about whatever culture India has to offer, but they see that, you see, 30 years ago, you know, if you were stuck somewhere in the middle of nowhere, you were in trouble. Whereas today you grab your smartphone, or if you don't have one, you ask anyone around you for a smartphone, you can get anywhere in the world. So that's what they see. And so, you know, India is doing well. And so that they like. And so therefore, You see, whatever else is being done strictly in the academic field, the feeling of alarm about Hindu nationalists in power is not really there anymore. Then what you can specifically do, well, keep on saying the truth, like for example, this, what I just mentioned about the Wall Street Journal manipulating the news, well, that of course should be emphasized. In this regard, it is very important that Hindus collect all the information, verify the information, because this is a real problem. Very many of these Twitter trolls and so on who you know, cultivate indignation about all the injustice done to Hindus, they are not accurate enough. And so they say things that can easily be shot down. You see, amid all the truth that they're saying, there are a few things that are, well, less than impeccable, and the enemy will immediately exploit those.
Right.
So you see, given that this is the approach of the enemy, well, you have to make sure that this problem doesn't happen anymore. But so that you know, saying, you know, this is really what we are up against, all this fake news by the Hindu bashing forces, that is a reality. And you have to explain to people that, you know, even though they didn't mean harm, nevertheless, that is the image of Hinduism that they have been taken in by. You know, as I think Mark Twain said, it is far easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled. And so this is, you know, this will take some work, you know, to really get people out of this thraldom to all the misinformation.
And you have also mentioned a very important thing about the eternal return of the Nazi nonsense.
Yes, this is Marcia Casolari,
Yeah.
an Italian scholar. I met her last summer. And so what she says about correspondence or meetings between the Mussolini regime and B.S. Munje and a few other Hindutva stalwarts is in principle correct. Much too much is made of it, though. The Hindu movement had already started, had grown up on its own steam, had its own themes that had nothing to do with Europe at the time. But yeah, here and there, somebody must have been fascinated with the air of discipline and of national unity that the fascist movement radiated. Other people have been impressed with fascism too, like Lloyd George, the former British Prime Minister, or Winston Churchill.
And Gandhi also.
Yes, and Gandhi also. And interestingly, what Churchill said about it would also apply to India. You see, he said, okay, democracy is a good system, or it's a bad system, but the best we have. That's what he said. But, you know, it's for grown-ups, like the British. Whereas the Italians are too emotional and, you know, not stable enough and so on. They need a strong leader. And so Indians likewise. So, I mean, that's his view, that's not mine. But so, I mean, this was, at that time, this was not taken very serious by anyone. So yeah, here and there were some people on the fringes of the Hindu movement. Or I will add even one more case, that K.B. Hedgewar, the founder of the RSS, once had a little conference with some of the fellow Hindu nationalists about the upcoming nationalist movements, which I think also already included the German version. But interestingly, they didn't pursue it. And it is perfectly correct that when something new comes up, you try to study it, to see what it means, what it is good for. And again, you see, the horror that we now feel about the fascist movements did not exist at that time. Not in Hindu circles, not in Muslim circles. Allama Iqbal, for example, was quite close to these new nationalist movements, or Inayatullah, or I mean several of these Muslim leaders. And Jinnah was not against it. He was only with the British because that's where he got his power from. Again, you see Churchill said explicitly, if I were German, I would wish that we really had someone like Hitler. But this was long before Hitler had started the war and so on. So at that time, you see, this impression existed. And so I would not be surprised if some in India, not only in the Hindu nationalist movement, but there too, some were temporarily, fascinated with it. But that they outgrew that. You see, they didn't pursue that line. And they kept on, with their own themes. Before the war started, before the Holocaust started, Guru Golwalkar, the second leader of the RSS, already contrasted the type of heroes that the Germans worshipped at the time, who were martial, with the what he calls the spiritual giants that stalk the Indian landscape in their majesty or something. At any rate, he makes the contrast between the kind of Hindu gurus with the kind of leader types that existed in the Western movements at the time.
This was in that very same book, The We Are Our Nationhood Defined, but nobody quotes these lines.
Yes, of course. You see that book, We Are Our Nationhood Defined, is mostly known for two quotations. One is that the minorities in India should, of course, be treated well. There should be no violence against them, no discrimination against them. However, they must see that they are foreigners and that therefore they shouldn't even have voting rights. Now, that's a view I don't agree with, but it's only that, I mean, throughout history there has existed plenty of inequality. That's something else than exterminating people. So it's not good, but it's also not too dramatic either. And the second line is where he refers to Nazi Germany, effectively, and where he says, the German example has shown how difficult it is for two peoples who are different to live together. So this is a reference not at all to the Holocaust, which hadn't taken place yet, but to the Nuremberg laws of 1935, in which the Jews were indeed excluded from the German nation. Like Jews were not allowed to wave the German flag, though they could use the Jewish flag, which became the flag of Israel. That they could do, and that was protected, and the Jews could live in Germany. It was also, for instance, decided at the time that professions in which the Jews were overrepresented, especially medicine and law, should be rearranged so that their percentage is only equal to their percentage of the population, which is today the whole policy of reservations. That's exactly what the Nazis started. And so, again, you see, this does not have my support, but it is only what it is. I mean, compared to what was later to happen, this is relatively innocent. Now, so Golwalkar already noticed, this is one solution for a problem that is really there, namely when two people are forced to live under the same roof, it's going to give conflicts, it's better to separate them. And you see, that ties in a more friendly, more positive way with the consistent support of the Hindu nationalist movement for the Zionist project. You see, they didn't understand much of this whole Western Jewish problem, but this much they noticed. You see, the Jews are a really existing separate nation, and you see whether their beliefs in the chosen land and so on, whether you have to accept it or not, doesn't matter very much because they are a really existing nation, so they need and they deserve to have a state. So already Savarkar in 1923 wrote in favor of the Zionist project. And so that was the positive side of it. So a very infelicitous expression in Golwalkar is that, well, you see, these two nations cannot live together. So, you know, I mean, I don't even have to be in favor of this. This is long ago, but nevertheless, this is not my viewpoint. But it's not more serious than it is. I think Golwalkar was mistaken. He was mistaken on quite a few points, in my opinion. But it's only that.
Right.
And so it does not have to do anything with anti-Semitism. I mean, this was unknown in India. They didn't know of this. Today on Twitter, you do meet a few Hindus who have, you know, first long ago cultivated their own conspiracy theories about Subhas Bose being still alive and, you know, whatever have you. But now, through the internet, they come in touch with all these Western conspiracy theories, like the Zionist world conspiracy.
Illuminati Zionists.
Yeah, or like somebody behind 11 September, or the chemtrails, or, you know, all these things. And so in India too, you have a few aficionados of those. So I wouldn't be surprised if the usual suspects pick these out and try to portray them. Oh, this is the new international.
They try to essentialize us.
That is not
That is
true
the
at all,
problem.
of course.
They try to essentialize us with those fringe elements.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Now, you mentioned about how the reservation policy in India
Yes.
is very much similar to the Nazi policy of slowly eliminating the Jews from public life. What I want to know is there some kind of a parallel between anti-Semitism and anti-paganism? Because the anti-Brahminism that we see in India is very much similar to anti-Semitism.
Yes.
And it essentially is not actually towards the Brahmins, it is essentially towards the Hindu culture. They see Brahmins as the vanguard or the protectors of Hindu culture, so they target Brahmins. And both of them come from the same Christian theology. So are there the parallels?
Yeah, well, there are parallels. Don't take them too far, but yes, there are parallels. In the cartoons that the two sides produce, there
You mentioned it
the
first.
similarity is very
You mentioned
striking.
it first in that cartoon of Why I Was Not a Hindu. In that cartoon is actually a adaptation of a Nazi cartoon.
Oh, yeah.
You showed that first, right?
Yes. Well, you know, the typical anti-Brahmin cartoons greatly exaggerate the physical oddities of Brahmins, you know, this hair and their paint on their face and so on. You know, not too many Brahmins today look like that anymore. But anyway, those cartoons are quite similar to the anti-Semitic cartoons, absolutely. But okay, you know, let's go to a more fundamental level. Something in common is that the Jews are very bright. And Brahmins in India, I don't know if they're bright, but they certainly have a number of merits to their credit. They're very overrepresented in leading scholars and scientists and so on. So that's a usual starting point for conspiracy theories. I'll give a third example of some unrelated movement. The president of Mozambique was killed in an air crash. So it was very innocent. At the time in South Africa, you still had the apartheid regime. And so many Africans started saying, oh, you see, that's some mysterious ray that has been sent by a South African bases on the ground to make this airplane crash. Now, that didn't happen, but so because the apartheid regime had indeed sophisticated weaponry, because of being, you know, having a siege mentality, they were bound to develop that. Therefore, everybody around it who was not involved looked up to them, and therefore looked up to them far more than what they were worth in reality. And so that also happens with the Brahmins in India, that happens worldwide with the Jews. And so all kinds of strange powers are attributed to them. And so one thing especially, both of them are supposed to be what Hitler called Drahtzieher, those who pull the strings. So it is said in Indian politics that, you know, it's not what you see, you know, there's a Brahmin hand behind it. And so that's a very important similarity. You don't even have to notice them doing anything wrong. You know, you can always say, oh yeah, but they're clever enough to hide what they're doing. Then they're both very bookish. You see, I mean, few people in India read books, Brahmins do. And so similarly, you see, Jews are very book-oriented. So there are those similarities. Now, when you come to theology, well, from a Christian viewpoint, there is a bit of a difference between Jews and pagans. Christianity is, of course, against pagans and wants to make paganism disappear. That's what they did in Europe. Whereas Jews had a special status. You see, Jews were not people who did not know the Savior yet, but people who had rejected the Savior.
Yes.
And that was more serious. You see, Christians who polemicize about their history of anti-Semitism try to wash their hands of it by saying, oh yeah, but you see, in Alexandria, in 200 before Christ, there were already struggles between the Jewish and the Greek population. Yeah, that's true. I mean, there are troubles once in a while between all kinds of groupings. Right. And so that was one of them. But you see, there was never any Greek religious book or so that said, oh, you see, now you earn merit, you go to heaven if you kill Jews. You see, that was not there at all. It is typical for Christianity that they have a specific problem with the Jews, which is that you have to choose between the link that the Jews will build with God, and then that which was replaced later by Jesus' tie with God, and so you can't have both. And the fact of their existence of the Jews is a standing challenge to Christianity
and Islam.
Yeah, that's a bit of a different story. I'll go into that. But you see, Christianity absolutely has something with Judaism. One thing in favor is that there is no ghetto in Europe in the Middle Ages for the worshippers of Jupiter or Wotan or someone, whereas there is a ghetto for the Jews. Right. It's only a ghetto, but at least they're allowed to survive. So the church had a complicated policy vis-a-vis the Jews, which, when religion becomes less important and biology, Darwinist biology, comes to the foreground, then it is simplified. Although the Nazis also didn't go all the way yet in the 1930s, they wanted to exile the Jews, send them to Madagascar or somewhere. It's only in war circumstances that then they opted for the violent solution. So you see, it's a bit simplistic to say, yeah, the church is responsible for the Holocaust. Nevertheless, they did give the Jews a special status. They did push them in a specific corner, which made them vulnerable to what happened in the Second World War. You see, with pagans, it's a bit different. The Christians didn't want to exterminate the pagans. They just wanted paganism to be gone. And so they did it quite cleverly, because in many parts of Europe, the Christians coming in were a small minority, just like in India. And so they did all kinds of inculturation. Like, for instance, They did not destroy the temples like the Muslim invaders did. No, you see, they left the temple standing, but they tinkered a little bit with the murti. Didn't immediately destroy it or destroyed it, but put a Jesus statue in place that looked a bit like what had been there before. And so they took them by the hand and gradually introduced them into Christianity, which, in terms of mass psychology is very clever. But so there's a different policy. You see, no toleration of the cult of any of the earlier gods. Like, for instance, in my village, where I now live, it's called Oude God, Old God, which is a name it has acquired in memory of a Jupiter statue that used to stand there, that was replaced by the missionaries with Jesus. But so Jupiter lived on in the memory of the people as the old god.
Oh.
Right. And so what you see there in Europe in the early Middle Ages is what you see now in India. You see this policy of inculturation, both from above and from below. Both popular customs, festivals, and so on are being Christianized, and then also the Upanishadic philosophy is, as far as possible, and with the terminology, introduced into Christianity. Though there you have two different tendencies. Some purists say, no, you see, we should not have anything to do with Hindu philosophy. Like there are some converts especially who protest, that, oh my God, you see, I had to, throw away my Krishna in order to bring in Jesus, and now you are saying that they're really more or less the same. So there are many, I don't know how many, but there are Christians who oppose this inculturation, but by and large the policy is to practice inculturation so that you don't notice too much that you're really changing religion.
Right.
But so at any rate, you see, they have a long-term goal. They know perfectly well that the people who are now getting converted, most of them are not very serious about Christianity. They become Christians for some practical advantages, material, or sending their kids to a Christian school or something. And so, they go through the motions, but they don't have their heart in it yet. But then the children go to school, and their children will not even have a memory anymore of Hinduism, and then you get real Christians. So they have that long-term perspective.
And I want to bring to your notice another one parallel in this. By the way, do you want to take some break, or you want to?
No, not at all.
No problem?
Go on.
Okay. And see, when I was researching for Breaking India book, one aspect was about St. Thomas.
Yes.
So in the St. Thomas myth, if you look at the original accounts of, original accounts means like 300 years before,
Yeah.
When they talked about the St. Thomas myth, it was about a scheduled tribe who killed him. And then because of that particular scheduled tribe, they got some kind of a disease or something. So this myth they have created.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as the time went on, this particular killing of St. Thomas, the responsibility of killing of St. Thomas was shifted from the scheduled tribe to the Brahmins. Mm-hmm. The Brahmins forced the king, and the king sent a person who killed St. Thomas. So the shift of killing St. Thomas had gone to the Brahmins, and anti-Brahminism and this St. Thomas myth, they somehow get harmonized.
Yes.
The same way, don't you see that the deicide, killing of Jesus, the blood of Jesus on the heads of the Jews and their progeny. In a similar way, they are constructing here. Wasn't it one of the major components of anti-Semitism?
Yes, okay. Yes, I didn't think of all of them at once. But this is indeed a very important one, blood libel. So the Jews had the blood of Jesus on their hands, Jesus being the Son of God. You see, that's a form of guilt that nobody else has. They can commit whatever crime, it can never be as bad as killing God. So, yes, you see, that was, of course, always held against the Jews. Like, for instance, Hitler greatly cultivated the passion play of Oberammergau, which was a traditional reenactment of Good Friday when Jesus is condemned to death, where this reproach against the Jews for having killed him, for having his blood on their heads, is of course greatly emphasized. And so with St. Thomas you have a similar thing. You see, to blame it on the Brahmins, which is really, really rich. The Indian Christians were welcomed in India, were accepted, were given a place in society by these, by the Brahmins and by the whole Hindu society. And then they make them guilty of having killed their saint. That goes very far. Now, of course, they themselves have a story of what really happened to St. Thomas. First, the oldest the oldest story about him is the Acts of St. Thomas, where he is taken to what is called India. But India at the time was a very big concept. When Columbus arrived in America, on the island of Hispaniola, he thought he had reached Japan. You know, an island which he knew to be on the eastern coast of Asia. And he called the people Indio, Indian, because India at the time was more or less Asia. And so, you know, if St. Thomas goes to Asia, that can still be many places.
Right.
Now there is a description of the people he meets, the landscape he is in. It's a desert-like landscape where the people speak Persian. So it's somewhere in Afghanistan probably. It had nothing to do with Kerala. And indeed, Pope Benedict, the last but one pope, has explicitly said so. You know, St. Thomas went to Asia, and then from there, Christianity went to South India.
Right.
Now, Christians say, yeah, but you know, there was a big Jewish community already in Kerala, and so there Christians may have found a place. Well, that's not strictly impossible. There are no proofs of that. You see, when we go by proofs, we would have to say Christians arrived in Kerala in the 4th century as refugees from Iran, where they were not liked anymore because the Roman Empire, their rivals, had become Christian. But okay, in theory it is possible. They may have come in 52 or so in the 1st century. Suppose. Then what, you see? Then that doesn't prove that Christianity is an Indian religion.
Right.
That doesn't prove that St. Thomas was among them, and so on. And even if St. Thomas was among them, again, he was just a traveler from Palestine. He had nothing specifically to do with India, though he was accepted in India. But so, when he was there in Afghanistan or thereabouts, according to the Christian story itself, he was given hospitality, but after a while he made himself so impossible that the king asked him, please leave. He was very gentle, you see, he didn't punish him or anything, he just said, well, we can't live together, so please go. And then St. Thomas was obstinate and insisted on staying there and keeping to his ways, and only then did the king say, well, now we have to punish you, now we're going to kill you. So that's only a story, but as far as stories go, it is at any rate totally different from the now official story of martyrdom at the hands of Brahmins.
Yeah, right. So it is that the Christian theological movement, even now, is churning out this kind of racist narratives so that it can help its evangelism.
Well, there is one thing I don't like to hear, is the word racist. You see, racism does exist here and there, but in the case of the...
Or I would say hate stereotypes.
The Christian rivalry with other religions, that's a different matter. You see, coming from Palestine I don't think he would look very different from people in, let's say, North India. So, I mean, it's not a racial issue. You see, in the Middle Ages in Europe, you see paintings of Palestine, which is really the European landscape, with snow and so on. Or in Ethiopia, you have black Christians who depict Christ as black. You see, the skin color was never an issue, and nor is it here. But yes, the hate ideology is absolutely there.
There is one.
Well, no. Let me correct myself.
Okay.
No, they themselves don't call it hate. No. What they say is that this is an important Christian doctrine. You know, hate the sin, not the sinner. So, you see, if you are an idol worshipper, you see, they don't hate you, they hate your idol worship. And because they love you, they want to bring you to the true faith. Because, you see, suppose they don't try to convert you, it means you are going to hell. Whereas they are going to heaven. And they like you so much that they want to keep you with them and take you to heaven. So they have to convert you.
Okay. I'll give you one specific instance that is happening right now as we talk in Tamil Nadu.
Yes.
Okay. There is a movement called Nam Tamilar movement. This movement is headed by a person called Seaman, who is actually a Catholic Christian. But he doesn't project his Catholic Christian identity. He projects only his Tamil identity. And he says that we are all Tamils, we have a separate Tamil culture, we have a separate Tamil religion, we are a separate Tamil race. And he accepts the Aryan invasion theory, and that the Brahmins are people who have come inside, the Aryan agents and all those kind of things. He accepts all that, and he creates this very, very strong, venomous thoughts. And in the posters, there among his heroes, this is in 2018-17, they put posters in which they put Hitler as one of their heroes and all that.
Right.
He gets invited to talk in prestigious Catholic institutions. The church fathers sit with him and they make him give lectures to the students. So, when they are away from the glare of international media, is the church reverting back to some of its old anti-Semitism like games in countries like India?
Well, I do not know very well to what extent Indian Christians are moved by this anti-Semitism. Because, I mean, I would think that it has little to do with the life experience in India.
Because another one thing is, as a child, I grew up in a Catholic dominant place. I have seen Passion Plays. And in these Passion Plays, the Catholics who were with us used to say that when the Pharisees or the Sadducees, they were talking to the Jesus and the Jesus was talking back to them, they used to say, see, this is how you people are rejecting Jesus. So, always they used to associate the Jewish authority with the...
Now you come to mention it. Of course, the Christian teaching, it's intrinsic to Christian teaching about the Jewish guilt. That is indeed there also in Indian Christianity. Like I heard the story of a tribe in the northeast that converted to Judaism. And so the background story is that they were disparaged and looked down upon by the other tribes. And so when the other tribes converted to Christianity, they said, well, since we are the fall guy, then let us become Jews. And then later they created the story that they were a lost tribe of Israel and so on. But so ultimately that is the background. So the looking down upon the Jews, that is there even in Indian Christianity.
One important prominent academician is Meera Nanda. And she has been projecting this ecology, Hindutva, they are all postmodernism and all these things grouped together, and she projects an evil image of Hindutva. And you have been countering it. Can you tell us about something?
Yes. Well, first of all, she gets a lot of respect from other secularists because she has a PhD degree not just in social sciences, but also in, I think, chemistry or biology,
Biology.
something serious. So she's proven that she's a real scientist, unlike all those others. But part of what concerns her is what is happening in the West, where you have quite a big, like, New Age movement, or what fancy names it goes under these days, consciousness and so on. And that is very much linked with India and with Hinduism. And Hindus in turn, especially Western Hindus, take over a lot of that, like Deepak Chopra and so on. They go with, Tao of physics and, all these attempts to tie in quantum physics with Eastern mysticism. So she restores the value of science as such, and the contrast between the scientific worldview and the religious worldview. So even though she's not active against Islam or Christianity, implied in her position is that, strictly speaking, along with Hinduism, Islam and Christianity should also be rejected. Though she doesn't really say that, she doesn't go out to say that, but strictly speaking, hers is a modern scientist, agnostic or non-religious viewpoint.
But she was also part of the Templeton Foundation, or she took grants from Templeton
Yes.
Foundation, which works with
Absolutely.
Christianity and science.
Yes, like in India, you do have a lot of intertwining between the Christian establishment and the anti-Hindu forces. You see both secularists and Islamists, and you see many of them are together, but often under the institutional patronage of the church. Yeah, and so she's an example of that.
Right. And how does the Hindutva side counter those kind of...
Let me first say about the Christian church. You see, they are fairly relaxed and open-minded, you see. Not everybody has to toe their line. Like, for example, the communists have rendered great services in terms of breaking Hinduism down, so that many of those Hindus stopped believing in Hinduism. And you see, while communism was only a temporary attraction, they ended up becoming Christians. And so that's how they see it, you just create a lot of chaos. Temporarily you get these not that robust enemies. You see, of course the Christians weren't in favor of communism, but communism was very useful to them. So that happens. And so, if some of their followers, under their umbrella are atheists or are Muslims or so, that's okay. You see, they have a long-term strategy where all these people can fit in. And so at the moment, their main goal is to harm Hinduism. That's why, for example, Narendra Modi did them the favor of including Christian refugees from Pakistan and Bangladesh into the CAA, but they didn't return the compliment.
Right.
They were very much against it. They totally threw in their lot with the Muslim side. But so for them, this is all very fine. You see, they themselves feel strong. They have a backbone. They have a tradition, a teaching, and so on. And that they instill in the next generation. And so even if the present generation is a bit lackluster in religious enthusiasm and so on, no matter, the next generation is there. As long as they have that generation, their plan is working.
Okay, Dr. Can I ask you the question, a very straightforward, blunt question. What is the problem if entire India gets converted to Christianity? What will the world civilization lose?
Well, from the viewpoint of all those who say that all religions say the same thing, there's no problem. And so many of these silly gurus, they tell their followers, all religions say the same thing. and yoga is also present in the Bible, and so on. Well, then you see Hindu parents who believe all this. They are surprised that one day their daughter comes and says, "Yeah, I'm going to marry a Muslim." And the parents panic. And the daughter says, "Yeah, but what's the problem? You have been saying all the time that all religions say the same thing." What is the problem with that is nothing dramatic. You can survive after you've converted. Life goes on. And in fact, many spiritual urges and so on are going to sneak back in through the back door. You're going to get Christian mysticism and Sufi mysticism and so on that are not the real thing, but that already shows that the spiritual urge has survived this process of conversion. Otherwise, well, it just goes on, life goes on.
No,
So
for
in
India-
a way, nothing happens. Only it's a great pity that people are believing in these silly fairy tales. I mean, you can make your children believe in fairy tales, but you can't go on with that. And so, I didn't feel like I had to leave Christianity because something important was at stake. No, you see, a very malleable, weak, unimportant thing was at stake, namely the truth. As a Dutch poet used to say, everything of value is vulnerable. You see, the truth is a very cheap thing. People will easily sacrifice it for whatever is in their interest. But, in these circumstances, I can afford the luxury of caring about truth. And then I find it very, very pitiable that people actually believe in the resurrection, in the virgin birth, in the revelation of the Quran, and so on. So you don't die from it, but it's just a pity.
But in your history of Europe,
Yes?
when Christianity came,
Yeah.
at that time there were scientists like Hypatia who had advanced science to a great level.
Yes?
And then there was almost 800 years of darkness with arrival of Christianity. Otherwise, we would have advanced
Yes.
even further. In the case of India, if suppose entire India gets converted to, let us say, Christianity or Islam, already in the northeastern states, you can ban books like Da Vinci Code and others.
Yes.
And in a case, Jammu and Kashmir, for a long time, teaching evolution was banned. Now, if suppose entire India gets converted to Islam or Christianity, the kind of freedom that we have, the kind of advancements that we have, won't that go back, and won't it be a dark period for India for a very long time?
Maybe so. No, I don't think so, because science is now so present that you can't that easily sideline it. You see, if one or two books get banned, well, it's a pity, it shouldn't happen, but it's not going to stop the march of science. Like, for instance, now, I don't know about India, in Europe, all the churches are closed. Or in Arabia, the Kaaba is closed because of the coronavirus. So their miracle working God apparently has no answer for the coronavirus. You see, for an answer to this virus, everybody's counting on science. They all hope that the scientists are sometime soon going to invent some cure. And so whatever still happens, these rearguard actions against science are not going to make that much difference.
So you think that if suppose India tomorrow becomes an Islamic republic, they are not going to ban teaching evolution?
That is a point which they really care about, so they may well. In that case, it will soon be found that the countries that still teach evolution are having an edge on them. You see, I mean, biology has a lot of ramifications, like, for instance, in medicine. And so denying evolution is going to hamper your progress in in medicine, and you're going to feel the consequences. So yeah, these things may sometimes happen, but I don't think that they have a long life.
But anyway, it will put India back by some, at least, if not centuries.
Yeah, of course,
decades.
I'm not at all in favor of it. See, in that sense, I'm with Mirananda. You see, who tries to reevaluate science. And so, in her view, of course, the rise of Hindu nationalism is a threat to science, though I don't see that.
Yeah,
I
it is not.
mean, in the Hindu nationalist movement, scientists are all over the place. Several RSS leaders were professors of physics and so on. I mean,
So how do you see the future of Hindutva as a movement and as a conceptual framework?
yeah, well, I never thought that that was really the answer. You see, Hindutva started in the 1920s. It was the heyday of nationalism for two different reasons. One was an international cultural atmosphere after the First World War. You see, all these armies in uniform came home, and there was a strong militaristic cultural atmosphere, like all kinds of singing choirs and sports teams and so on would march through the streets in uniform. There were a lot of military atmosphere, and so you see some of that in the uniform of the RSS. They're marching with brass bands, for example. Not very Indian, by the way. Okay, and then the second pole is the freedom movement. At that time, there was something very respectable about being a nationalist. Namely, you wanted to achieve freedom for your country. So that's good. And so in that atmosphere, I have no comment on the nationalist language and imagery that they used. But, we are a century onwards. With 1945 came the fall of nationalism, even though many nationalists had been pro-French or, pro their country and therefore against the Germans. So in a way, it's not a defeat of nationalism. Nevertheless, those who were most explicit about it and who took that imagery with them were the Axis powers. And so nationalism has gone out of fashion. And until a few weeks ago, the RSS seems not to have noticed it. You see, it must be quite a strange feeling for some European who comes here for the first time and notices a Hindu praising someone as a nationalist. You see, for us it's a dirty word. And so in India, what is meant by it is someone who is in favor of the unity and integrity of the nation, which is not a bad thing. Because what you have as alternative for nationalism is other nationalisms. You can have Tamil nationalism, for example. But it's better to have an integrative vision, like a good approach to that is Deen Dayal Upadhyay's integral humanism. And so they had, when he coined that term in the 60s, the Hindu nationalist movement ought to have taken it from there. You see, this integral humanism is a far better, far more convincing formula that, in a way, counts and has something to offer to the whole world. Whereas with nationalism, you're still one stage earlier. You see, nationalism was, of course, a step forward in the sense that it created solidarity between people who didn't know each other. Before that, you had clans or castes in India that were concerned with one another, but not with the rest of the world. With nationalism, suddenly someone from Tamil Nadu was in solidarity with someone from Kashmir. And someone upper caste was in solidarity with somebody lower caste. It's something that is not noticed very much in the hostile literature, the anti-Hindu literature, that the Hindu nationalist movement is by and large anti-caste. Wanted to bring the people together rather than keep them in their separate boxes. But so, that nationalism may have had its day, but that's over. Although I should be careful with what I say, because nowadays this coronavirus scare is recreating nationalism in a big way. All the borders are coming back. But so that, that is a bit of a mistake, but not very important. Most of their policies are not really dictated by that little word nationalism. Okay. But I think that the tendency of being just Hindu rather than Hindutva is slowly reasserting itself. Like, for example, I've now started studying the life of K.C. Aryan, was a painter in the 20th century. And he regularly showed his, not contempt, but his, he just didn't like all this puffed up nationalism, this ultimately imitating the Western fashions at the time, like the Arya Samaj starting monotheism, like the RSS starting nationalism. Well, Hinduism has something better to offer. At the time already, Voice of India, of Ram Swarup and Sitaram Goel, were emphasizing Hindu-ness as such, not Hindutva, the political, synonym in fact of Hindu nationalism. So, I think that people will grow out of this 20th century imagery and language, and will more revalue Hinduism as such. Hindu Dharma is proper name.
No, the one final last question.
Yes.
It is about your pilgrimage through the entire Hindutva movement. What are your feelings? What is the price that you have paid in your academic life?
Well, the price I have paid is simply exclusion from the academic sphere to some extent. I mean, I get allowed and even invited to conferences and so on, but actually giving me a post in the university, that's a bridge too far. That is not going to happen. But nothing serious has happened, I've not been killed or anything.
Right.
So that's okay. But otherwise, journey through Hinduism, well, most of the time I've only been a spectator. Like, for example, essential for Hinduism is not the gods, is not Vishnu or Shiva or so. Far more essential for Hinduism is the purity rules, which now with the coronavirus at the moment, you see, maybe by the time people see this, that will be over already. But with the coronavirus, everybody's talking about all the presidents in the world are now saying namaste rather than giving a handshake. Right. That's part of these purity rules. And so when it comes to these purity rules, I never much observe them. I take my shoes off in a room or in a temple, but otherwise, you see, Hindus are far more serious and far more detailed about it. Like, for instance, for a while I've eaten with my hands like my hosts do, but I've given that up. You see, I'm maybe a bit too Western for that. But, given what I've done of studies in Hinduism, I hope I have been worth my presence here in spite of these
in fact, you have been a great inspiration for all of us, and you have been a mentor for a lot of people who have taken the cause of Dharma and Rashtra. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Namaste.